It shouldn't come as a great surprise to anyone, and I certainly hope that I don't offend anyone with this statement, but the issue of gun laws in the United States is quite a complicated one. And it seems to be the invariable case that whenever anyone says anything on the subject, they're rather rapidly drowned in a sea of angry comments. But I've no qualms, thankfully, with shameless profiteering off of so fiery and heated a debate, so let's complain, shall we, my dear viewer, about a commercial. Now, I should clarify before going further, this is not a political video, and by commenting on the accuracy, for lack of a better term, on the musketry display in this commercial, I am not offering a censure, a criticism, a promotion, an agreement, or any other kind of statement on the overall message of the commercial. This video is pure historical pedantry. So first allow me to play the commercial in question for you, and then we'll go through and complain about it.
Excuse me. Hey! Hey!
So if you want to just add those in, we can send them all over.
Right, so it's fairly straightforward. A particularly dour-looking man enters a workplace with a musket intending to commit murder. He fires at a man, misses his mark due to the inaccuracy of the smoothbore firelock, and begins to reload. But the process takes so long that his target and all bystanders are thankfully able to escape unharmed. The political message here is quite clear, and it's made more so by the note written at the very end. But as I've already said, I'm not interested in the politics. I'm interested in the musketry display, which, for our purposes here, gets quite a few things wrong. First things first, listen to when he presents his piece. We hear what can only really be described as a generic gun noise of sorts. It sort of sounds like a lever-action rifle being operated very, very slowly, or perhaps the slide on a modern pistol being pulled back. But either way, it's certainly not the kind of noise that we get from a musket coming to the full cock. This is what it actually sounds like when a musket is made ready to fire. And if we compare that to what we have here, and what's more is, not only is the sound of the gun being made ready to fire inaccurate, but look at when the noise is being sounded. This is the exact frame when we hear that noise, and the man's hand is well away from that lock. Now, it would be one thing if the fake noise sounded as he was pulling back the cock, but it's quite another thing when the man is just raising up his gun. What on earth is actually making that noise? Did somebody next to him and out of camera shot have a pistol that he loaded before just walking away? Did a coworker perhaps play the mysterious sound over a speaker to make the would-be killer sound more intimidating? It's a common sin, sadly, in any sort of media involving firearms, that they're always clicking and clacking all around, whether or not anything's actually happening on the screen to cause that noise to begin with, and sadly, this is no exception. But as the man raises up his firelock, we see that they actually did get something right with the loading. As you can see in this shot, the weapon is at the full cock position, and the steel, or the frizzen as it's known in modern terminology, is shut over the pan. So thankfully there's none of that nonsense where a musket magically goes off after the flint scrapes nothing but air. And not only that, but the weapon is actually fired more or less authentically, and we can see a flash in the pan. And what's more is that the sound of the musket firing is really quite good. It sounds really appropriate to an actual musket shot. But look at the smoke that's generated from the shot. It's evident there that while the flash in the pan caused a fair bit of smoke, none actually came out of the barrel. And as we zoom out, we see, yes, there's a little bit of smoke clouding to the top, but if the musket had actually fired, this camera shot would be far more obscured. What I imagine happened here is that they loaded the musket with a small amount of priming powder so that they could make a good looking bang and produce some smoke for the camera, but for, well, fairly obvious reasons, they didn't actually put any powder down the barrel. They also didn't think to use any sort of movie magic, I suppose, to make it look as if the musket actually had been fired. You can also see that when the man pulls the trigger, there's no recoil at all. And in reality, firing a .71 caliber musket can give you quite a kick, and no attempt seems to have been made here to actually display the real force of firing a piece of this scale. And as the initial smoke clears, we can see the result of the man's shot. His target, thankfully, is unharmed, with a rather significant hole left in the wall there. So there's two things here. One, that is a very large bullet hole, and that's good, because you see, the soft lead round of a musket isn't nearly so efficient as a modern bullet is. And while they often leave a somewhat clean entry wound, a musket ball will actually flatten on impact, or, start to flatten out on impact whenever it hits its mark, which causes a far nastier exit wound and can cause really severe damage to the internals of a victim. So indeed, I should think that shooting a musket ball at a wall like that would result in similar damage. On the other end, though, are we to believe that this man, this premeditated murderer, is so horribly inept with his firearm that he missed a mark so large and at such a close range? Now, I understand that what they're meaning to show here is that compared to a modern rifled firearm, smooth-bore muskets are terribly inaccurate. But this particular portrayal is a gross exaggeration of that inaccuracy. Keep in mind that people do still use smooth-bore muskets to hunt, and indeed the fellow who owned my Brown Bess used it for such a purpose before I owned it. And it's possible, keep in mind, with very limited training at marks, to hit a man-sized target in a battlefield setting, no less, in upwards of 100 yards. And in this sort of environment, where the victim was stationary only a few feet away and there was nothing obstructing the shooter's vision, the shooter would be, I think, fairly hard-pressed to not hit his target. And indeed, if the shooter did hit his mark, the man would be, I'm afraid to say, far less likely to survive his wounds than if he had been shot with a modern firearm. Again, because of how efficient modern bullets are in comparison to musket shot. It changes the way that it wounds a person internally. And let alone, of course, if the shooter was really serious about doing some damage, and he could have loaded with buck and ball rather than just a single round. It seems to me that this inaccuracy in particular really weakens the overall political message of this video, as indeed, murder might very easily be committed with a musket just as readily as with any other firearm. I think it would have been a far better scene if the man actually came to the present but then misfired, if he pulled the trigger but nothing actually happened, because that sort of problem is far more common when it comes to having to fire a musket. Trust me, I know, flintlocks are very temperamental things, and they don't always work out as planned. And one final inaccuracy before we call it quits here is, look at how the man reloads. Now, on the bright side, we see him here priming his pan offensively before casting the weapon about, then he starts to pour down the powder from the cartridge, but then he drops the cartridge onto the floor. He then proceeds to ram home loose powder. He never reaches into his pocket to retrieve a ball, and of course, historically speaking, it's in that cartridge that the musket ball would be kept. Historically speaking, you tear the top of the cartridge off, you pour a little bit of gunpowder into the pan to prime your piece, you shut the pan, you cast the weapon about, and you pour the remaining powder down the barrel, and then you drop the full cartridge with the bullet still inside down the barrel, and that is what you ram down. In that case, the paper cartridge is actually serving as the wadding between the round and the powder. And the loading process is made far easier than if you carried the bullets separately and had to prime with the paper, send the cartridge down, and then put the bullet down separately. That's why the bullet would be kept in the same unit as the cartridge. And if this man was, very keen to do a fair amount of damage, I feel like he would have, come in with a proper, fully pre-assembled cartridge, as opposed to dropping it on the floor like that. Of course, in the end, I suppose ramming is certainly made far easier when you don't even have to load a bullet to start with, but instead just drop the bullet onto the floor. Although, I suppose criminal activity may be a little bit tougher at that point. Well, I suppose I'm no expert on that sort of thing. Until the next time, my dear viewer, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of sevens.